All right. Well, welcome everybody. I think we've just got a few more just joining our webinar there, so I might just watch that through. But yeah, I'll just give it a few more seconds there, Simon. So
Okay.
fantastic. All right, I think we're good to go. It's 6 p.m. In Strata world, we would say we have a quorum. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. Today's webinar, we're covering off the fire regulation changes. This is covering off the new changes effective from the 13th of February. So I know it's a hot topic in question, AS 1851 requirements. Coming through. So I know these things are a hot topic of discussion, especially with these changes and compliance requirements. I just want to start by introducing yourself, Simon, and myself. Simon Rickard, National Technical Manager for the Fire Protection Association Australia. So thank you very much for joining us. I know it takes time out of your day to do this, but your role, I guess, is being across all of this and also for fire practitioners. And my name is Paul Colby. I'm the Head of Governance and the Group Licensee in charge for Jamesons here. So I want to thank everyone for attending. Today's webinar, we're going to cover off all the details of fire and the changes that have come into place from the 13th of February that are basically affecting every strata building in New South Wales. Now, this is about explaining, understanding our rights and obligations as an owner, as an owners corporation, and it's a what better way to have yourself in attendance here, Simon. Now, I know we're going to have a fair few questions of this topic, so you've got your chat or you've got the Q&A. Please put those questions through. We will look at trying to get through every single question we can. If we don't, this webinar is recorded and we will definitely be able to send the Q&A shortly after the session with a link to the webinar. So I know I've had a few apologies that have come prior to this. Not a problem. It is a recorded session. We do love it when you're attending and make our session interesting with the questions that come into place. So I'm going to get straight into it there. Um, what we want to really cover off, and Simon, I'm going to pick your brain, and we're also going to look at it in a strata perspective, is why it matters, fire safety compliance to our clients. What are the real changes? We're using the words AS 1851, so we really want to understand the building's obligations, understanding the annual fire safety statement. So I know everyone's probably sitting here saying, I know what it is, but what it also means. I'm also going to touch on the aspects because we've done this training with our strata managers and our compliance team. So what we're providing today is basically exactly the same in that regard to our owners, committees, clients, what it means. I'm going to probably touch on the aspect of unit renovations just briefly and fire safety because I think they do work hand in hand. And any questions that you should be asking at the AGM from owners as well. So hopefully we can get these answered for you, and if not, we will definitely do so after this webinar. So, why it matters? I think, look, Simon, we talk about fire safety. Fire safety, I guess, in the long time I've been doing it, has come a long way. I remember being the ones looking at multiple certificates, but really getting back to the basics. And I know everyone knows this, but it's about protecting lives. It's making smoke alarms, fire doors, sprinklers, give them time to escape when there's a fire. It's really protecting the asset. You know, the maintenance limits fire damage as well, especially where you've got fire panels having to engage the provisions of the fire brigade. What we need to acknowledge is in this change also the penalties have been made more clearer. They've written them up and I think they've increased as well, Simon, in that regard. And I'm going to get you to touch on that in this slide. And also building insurance. They're asking more questions about the annual fire safety statement, etc., so on. So it's not only just become a legal requirement, but it's about keeping our home and predominantly the communities that we live in safe here for our schemes. So, what's changed and what's mandatory? So, Simon, I've put in the details here, but you know, AS 1851, there was a delay getting this live, but we know now it's here to stay. We know it's mandatory and what it means in practice. So there's a little bit of a point here before and after. I might pick your brain in terms of in the Fire Protection Association in Australia, what you see in terms of what we used to do and what we used to what's now introduced, in your opinion, as the technical national expert. Now,
Yeah. No, thanks, Paul. And what's interesting is nationally, 1851 is the mandated maintenance standard across all states and territories. And New South Wales was the last to fall in line with that. And for I'm located here in Melbourne, and for the service providers nationally, we actually had a very good understanding what a good version of 1851 is. And you can see, and from my own experience being based here in Melbourne, I was able to see what historically was acceptable in New South Wales and what needed a change in New South Wales. And as you sort of outlined there, what happened prior to February 13th was a service provider and a building owner, they could undertake whatever routine service they felt appropriate under the circumstances, which then meant that certain activities that are very critical activities to the operational functionality of a life safety system were almost voluntary, whether or not you needed to undertake that work, which then had the consequences of not being able to really understand precisely where that information needs to be kept. So therefore, the mandated requirement of 1851 to maintain service records wasn't required in New South Wales. And from a national perspective, service providers do take the responsibility of reporting defects and ensuring that building owners are aware when a system has a non-compliance, a non-conformance, or more importantly, when a system has criticality. And 1851, though it doesn't stipulate the how defects at what speed they should be rectified, but it certainly does the reporting, which then focuses the attention of the building owner that the service provider needs to within 24 hours make a building owner aware of a defect, critical defect, and then the onus at that point is with the building owner. And that's one of the more significant changes in New South Wales, is because there wasn't a requirement under the maintenance of fire safety for that to be the case. There is under WHH regulations, there was a bit of that, but not as clearly defined as 1851. And what New South Wales has, which is a very positive that we don't have nationally, is to the level that you have in New South Wales, is your annual safety statement, which then creates a degree of confusion between what's an 1851 activity and what's an AFSS activity as well. So that's also a challenge there. Yeah.
so in summary, what we're looking at, it seems as though what we had, even though we had an annual fire safety statement, it was pretty much a bit more informal, and now it's created more formality and more formal aspect in record keeping, right?
Yeah, so obviously, AFSS, the fire safety statement, always required a competent person, a ASFP, an accredited practitioner, to sign off that a system will operate. It's as per its original design. They endorse that. But what 1851 does, it's a side issue that ensures that the functionality of that system will operate as it was designed to. Where one is as per its original design, 1850, which is more of a review of information, an assessment on a site, whilst 1851 does the operational testing that leans into that to say that the system that we endorse as per the original design, we can now functionally test that system and meet that requirement. As they're separate requirements, but they go hand
Yeah.
in hand in New South Wales.
Thank you. So you would really say it's a standard. So the when we start saying, keep saying AS 1851, 1851, whichever way we do it, it's a new standard that's required for the AFSS measure. I know we're going to get into more detail, so I don't want to give you get you to give too much away on this slide, but I think it's common rationale that we're going to use those standard terms. I think in an owner's corporation sense, they may see that in communication and quotes and be prepared that that's a standard we operate through. Now, it's interesting because when we look at buildings obligations, and here, I sort of look at an owner's corporation, it consists of many owners, from a minimum of two right up to the provision of 300, 400, 1,000, right? And there's the obligation aspect. And this is one thing you sort of look at when these introduction of these regulations come into place. Now, an owner's corporation, probably in a Strata's perspective, I might touch on this, has an obligation to repair and maintain common property. So Section 106 of the Strata Schemes Management Act really covers that off. And then there's an obligation to engage suitably qualified or competent persons. And we're using a lot more the words of practitioners these days. If, we've previously looked at the Design Building Practitioners Act for builders and waterproofing works, but it's sort of leaning this way for fire safety. And then they've got to service the provision to the standard of AS 51, and that's now mandatory. And there's this interesting part of keeping records on site, maintaining logbooks. Now, I know I've got a few questions to that, and I'm quite curious to see and hear your position, but they've got to maintain them on site for 7 years. Then submitting the annual fire safety statement. Now, maintaining common property, I think we all understand there's a duty, there's an obligation to repair and maintain. We know Building Commission Office has got more power.
So who's frozen? All the turn back. Guys, just making everyone aware that Paul's got some transmission issues, so he'll be joining us again shortly. Um, what I could do, I can see if I've got the presentation. Um, let's see if I could pick this up. In Paul's absence, I'll see if I can get the presentation up on the screen. So look, I've shared a screen. If I put the chat up, I was just hoping someone can let me know that you can see the presentation. Um, there's Paul coming back on.
There we go. Sorry about that. There was just a bit of a technical malfunction there. Sorry. I just want
Am I
to.
sharing my screen now, Paul? I was going to do your job.
You are.
I'll
Do you
stop it.
mind if? Yeah, and I'll reshare. Sorry about that.
There we go, mate.
Sincerest apologies. The joys of technology these days. Sometimes I'm not the best at it. Sorry. I'm not sure how far we got, but I just sort of wanted to sort of touch on this there, Simon. We were talking about the logbook provisions, and I know we've got a few questions there about the logbooks
Yeah.
and storing them on site. So there's a few good ones there about talking about, hey, when we look at the provisions of the storage of logbooks on site, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so the standard, and for very good reason, is clear. And as much as people do talk about electronic records, etc., etc., the fire brigades nationally will always require hard copy logbooks on site. Now, if you have got an electronic system, it's on the service provider to ensure that there is a hard copy left on site at the conclusion of that test. So, though they may use an electronic system, they need a method of leaving a hard copy report that's reflective of the activity on site, not just a log of attendance saying I was here on this given date. Not at all. It needs to detail the activity that was undertaken, and those records need to be maintained, as you've said, for 7 years. Now, I did see
So,
a message in the on the
yeah,
chat around where they're located. 1851 doesn't dictate where they or stipulate where they're to be located, but it's the building owner's responsibility to ensure that those records are available. So they need to take whatever precaution they deem appropriate. It might be a lock cabinet. Typically, they're in a fire panel. They're in a sprinkler pump room sitting on top of the fuel tanks. So they just need to ensure that they're the building owner's records, that they're secure and they're readily available for when the fire brigade turn up, or in New South Wales where they might be subject to an inspection from council.
yeah. So, one of the questions that came up, and I had a few discussions this week, Simon, and just a bit of bounce on you, because some of the questions are coming up in what is the logbook? And commonly, you're looking at what is my asset schedule of fire measures. They then go into the logbook, do they? And then they have the items that have been tested against them.
Yeah, so the 1851 is not an asset schedule. It's testing the equipment. So it's
Okay.
18 and 1851 is in effect a standard, a generic standard, and it can't be customized to the point for each site. So what
Okay.
1851 isn't an asset schedule. It'll detail the activity that's required on any given asset to ensure that that's being tested appropriately under the standard. So it's a
Cool.
record of an activity that's undertaken.
Yep. No, thank you. And look, the on-site logbooks, I know you've got hydrants that have these little tag books, etc., already on site. One of the things is, you've got these main distribution frame rooms or a fire pump room. You could look at keeping them in there because they are accessible by the 003 or the NMB keys. Would that be ideal in that regard? And would we put a sign saying logbook in the switch room or in the pump room?
Yeah, typically the people who need to know, they generally know because they're not just working on your site, they're working on other sites. So they know that typically a fire panel will be located at a reception or in a lobby, and there'll be a logbook inside the panel or on top of the panel, and equally in a pump room. The
Yeah.
challenge comes with, as you said, about hydrants, hose reels, extinguishers. They typically are kept, and in support of that, the service provider needs to know where every extinguisher, every hydrant, every hose reel is. So they would have an asset register. So that asset register helps them do their job. It's not required under 1851 because 1851's job isn't to make sure all the asset information is on site. It's to make sure that the asset is maintained appropriately. Now, that service provider should have an asset schedule on the site because they're coming to site to test every hydrant hose reel extinguisher. They should provide, and the standard permits this, they need to provide a record within 7 days when you're undertaking items of those sort. So someone comes in and tests the hydrant and extinguisher, they need to provide a building owner with an electronic copy of that, and the building owner then, in effect, may have the responsibility of ensuring that they need to maintain that on the site appropriately.
So you're saying it could be kept electronically on site as well
No, a
as
hard copy needs to be kept. So
a hard copy.
you get an
And that
email.
obligation of the hard copy, I want to clarify this from the because I've had these questions
Yeah,
come up this week and they're coming up now,
yeah,
is that the hard copy being retained on site is the building owner's obligation. What about
correct.
what about the contractor, the practitioner doing these works?
It depends on what the contract details in actual fact. So they're delivering 1851 doesn't stipulate who provides the information. Yeah. So
Okay.
the building owner needs to ensure compliance with 1851. So you could have within your contract, you put it on the onus on the service provider to say, your job is, in addition to undertake servicing to 1851, you need to maintain compliant site records to 1851.
And so just in that regard, I think, the one thing is to note there's no, from what my reading, there's no standardized format. So there's no standard logbook that they complete themselves. It's how they do it in that regard. And the
But
one thing,
in saying that, Paul,
mm,
each there's activities listed under 1851, and you need to. It's a pass or fail criteria. So
yeah.
you actually need to respond that you've passed or failed every single activity. And as much as there may be generic logbooks, the contents of those logbooks need to be compliant with 1851. So every activity, every task needs to be fully detailed in any site records.
So I want to be crystal clear here because the question of logbooks is here. It's not up to the owner's corporation or the committee or the manager to create the logbook. It's to them to make sure the logbook is maintained on site.
That's
Now,
correct. And
yeah,
I'll just say
cool.
the service
Thank you.
provider needs to reflect that their activities compliant with 1851. So that's where
Yeah.
one leads to the other.
I'm sort of feeling here there's going to be a lot of service fire contracts needing to be revisited as we go along. Now, there's a question here, and I just want to answer that. Does Jamesons file our reports and keep them on the portal? Now, I don't want to keep the questions to last, but I think it is relevant. We do maintain all reports under your building reports and compliance categories, but this sounds like this is above and beyond and more in that regard, right?
So which question is that? Can I?
That was from Tracy there, but it was about the reports that we received from the fire safety contract. Oh no, sorry. Does Jamesons also file our reports and keep them on the portal? We do, but we also have the requirement to keep the logbook on site as well.
Correct. And there is, and from a terminology perspective, there is a difference between logbooks and reports because
Yeah,
reports support the logbooks in a way.
yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Now there was one provision here, and we want to look at buildings pre-1988. New South Wales is probably the leaders in strata management, but also I think has, what some of the first strata schemes that were ever created. And they generally may not have an annual fire safety statement if they haven't been issued a fire order, etc. But we've got this obligation to repair and maintain common properties. So you've still got the obligations to comply with the smoke alarm requirements. If there is a fire safety order, which, I think is becoming quite common these days to undertake these works to bring the buildings up to the standards. There are provisions where they may need to respond to fire safety orders that will enable them to keep fire doors, exits, signs, and extinguishers on site, along with detection systems. But there's also a consideration to, I guess, upgrade fire safety measures proactively too. Now, when we look at this, there's a bit of a case law in terms of the obligations, but if we're not necessarily submitting an AFSS, but we have fire safety measures, we have to maintain them by suitably qualified practitioners and trades, and that sort of becomes applicable. Is that your take on that there, Simon?
Yeah, I know in the lead up to February 13th, that was an often discussed point. And
Well, I just
and
want to say, Simon, the day this legislation came out on February 13th, sounds it should have been Friday the 13th, but nevertheless.
yeah, 100%. And we were fortunate enough to have representatives of the local council, the council organisation, and they really helped us sort of try to get that sort of messaging across. And that that they still has, even if there's no AFSS as such, the building owner still has a duty to maintain any fire safety equipment. And now that there's a mandated standard, how could you not use 1851 in those instances? Because it's now accepted as the standard that which buildings should be maintained. So pre 1988 buildings, the building owner still has a duty to maintain any fire safety equipment or system installed in that building, um, and to ensure that they're not placing the occupants of the building at risk.
And in terms of that, it's just maintaining what is currently there. Are they obliged, if they have it there, that they've got to upgrade it to the current
No,
standard? Or
and once again, and that's
yeah,
one of the sort of the misnomers around 1851. There is no trigger in 1851 to anyone to spend any money on a building that if to upgrade that. And there might be defects associated with buildings, and we did hear people who spent a lot of money on the buildings. And typically, we don't quite, comment on a site by site on a site by site basis. But there might be reasons why those assets needed to be upgraded because they weren't functioning. A fire pump wasn't operating correctly. A panel was obsolete. Those sort of things. So, but there's no activity in 1851 that if you fail that, you say you got to upgrade it. Now, when you go and do an activity and it's not successful, obviously you go back to the building owner and you say, hey, that system didn't operate as intended. And at that point, that now triggers a whole different conversation. 1851 identified the issue. It doesn't fix the issue.
no, thank you, Simon. It's very good advice. Yeah. I think we get a lot of those questions come through, so I
It was
appreciate you
to be
explaining
honest, it
that.
was non-stop, Paul, to be honest. We're at pains to stress 1851 doesn't make you do the work. It identifies the work that needs to be
Yeah.
done.
Now, the good part, the annual fire safety statement. So, you 3 months, you've got this time to do an inspection. And you've got to get your inspection done, secondary inspections possibly. Then you've got to get the defect reports, the quotes, and the annual fire safety statement being the formal declaration that says, right, it's ticked off and it has to be signed by and assessed by an accredited practitioner, fire safety. And it has to be found to be capable of performing their standards. And what we're looking at is now they have to be accredited under an approved industry scheme and the owners corporation taking that in place. And these statements then go to council, fire and rescue. Tell us a bit more about this because the statement isn't just an acknowledgement, a piece of paper that we put on the notice board anymore. It's pretty
No,
serious.
and to be honest, as I said at the start, what New South Wales does leads Australia, and here in Melbourne, it would be fantastic if we had an AFSS because what the AFSS does is it ensures that the original consideration that was made when a system was designed, that's reassessed on an annual basis. So you're looking at the system and you're asking yourself, is this going to be, will this building operate as it was designed to? And it's a very important question that you need to ask and then answer. So, in what we have on with the accredited inspectors, so assessors, they come in and with their knowledge, they review the information that's available on a site, and they then make a determination as to whether or not that will indeed be the case. And there is a step that follows that involves 1851. Will I go down that path now, Paul, and speak about how we're
I
at?
think we're going to go into that in a little bit more
Yeah, yeah.
detail. What comes through my mind is when we look at this, and one of the things is the anniversary date is quite clear, 12 months from the last time you've submitted the statement. So if anyone's got any queries on from this session of when my AFSS is due, please reach out to us. We're happy to provide that clarification. Now, the one thing noting, a lot of this time in the last few years has been a lot more about fines and the clarifications of up to $88,000 for fines and then up to 88,000 each week for continued failure. Like it's getting pretty serious in this regard. Like, and when I sort of queried this and inquired that, I thought this is a bit harsh, isn't it? And he said, well, you'd be surprised how many buildings we identify that go without submitting an annual fire safety statement. And I was quite shocked, having dedicated push and team to do this and get this into place. But the fines are significant though too.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also worth noting not every council in New South Wales requires the AFSS. So it's sort of inconsistent in a way. And that was one of the discussions we had with we were involved with the building commission, and they were involved with our presentation. That those there was there was going to be no leniency in that regard, and that it was really up to the councils on how they administer the
Yeah.
fines. Yeah, yeah,
Now, going into, sorry, the next part here, the penalties, probably jumped the gun there, but one of these things is, I think there's a question of, we're keeping a record on site. What happens if the building burns down or it can burn? I think, it's really coming to a point they've applied this structure on fines in these new legislation, these new laws and regs. But it also seems as though we may anticipate possible spot checks, and these are the sort of fines that can come up. What's your view on that? I mean, you're working nationally, you're seeing that for New South Wales, there seems to be this lot of provisions that they may, do these inspections, or if the fire panel's going off was an example I was given, the fire brigade could check if they come to site, if there's a logbook on site, even if it's a false alarm. Is that correct?
yeah. The fire brigade and nationally have any right to enter any building, and it's there are. I've had situations in the past when they've walked past the building and heard a panel beeping, and have walked in and rung the service provider and worked with the service provider to fix that. And I guess it's a resourcing and it's an availability of suitable sort of people who understand the systems, and that's both fire agencies and councils as well.
Yeah.
But there
Thank you.
are a significant number of fire agencies, members, and councils who actually understand how systems operate, and they're
Mm.
well within their right to enter buildings, and as a consequence, start asking questions.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And look, there's one question here just on this. When you look at this, is, I've got 30 fire alarms that passed the test, two did not. We should not wait until the two are fixed or replaced. We must instead display the 30 passed, second failed within 7 days, and then follow the fixed display. A new statement saying 32 passed. Is that your presence opinion on that there,
Yeah.
Simon?
So what from an 1851 perspective, and so putting the AFSS to one side, a service provider is contracted to test the system and identify the issues, and that job of that test is to ensure the system will operate as required. And if there's two failed, the onus is on the service provider in the first instance, going back to building owner, said you've got to fix these two issues. And there's no grounds for those two issues not to be fixed.
Yeah,
Now, there'll be procurement issues, there'll be programming issues, there'll be all manner of issues. And um, at that point, the service provider, it's like a game of tennis, they hit the ball over the net. They put it onto the building owner, you need to fix that. And the building owner's now got the instruction on their computer that they need to fix that problem. And
yeah.
they would want to, our recommendation would be that building owner now needs to hit the ball back over the net and get those repairs undertaken so that that system can be reliably enforced to operate as intended. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon. Now, sort of going to that in terms of what to expect from the strata manager, because to me, this was a really point of view where we've got owners, we've got customers, we've got clients, committees, and owners. And one of those things is having a dedicated team to really look at this, monitor this. When we did training internally, it was really important to understand our obligations. So, coordinating the fire safety services contracts, ensuring that AFSS is prepared and submitted on time, getting these defect reports to the committee, as you just pointed
Yeah.
out, the reason to do that and why to do that. We want to be able to manage the records. So we no doubt can manage all the records. They're all coming in and being kept on portals, accessibility for our committees and owners. But there's also the logbook provisions. And then there's a provision that I had a few opinions in terms of compliance costs. So having to look into your budgets. Is it a capital works expense once off for the logbook, then the ongoing maintenance of that? And I think one thing that's really important is we can understand things are going to take time. And if we need to, we will effectively communicate with council as well. If it's one thing I learned that was interesting, you cannot ask for an extension. You have to ask for a pin. Bless Vanessa, our team does a wonderful job as the head of compliance, but always is asking for a stay of pin, which is a stay of infringement, stay of a fine,
Yeah.
really. So don't book us. We're doing something about it, and they're quite positive to respond in that way, as long as they
100%.
seem to do something.
100%.
But these are things that under the delegated reports we're giving to our clients is, if you want to attend an AGM or an update, there's a fire safety motion there. Ask those questions. We're all skilled up to have the answers in that regard. I think
And
for
what
an
and
owner's.
I was going to say, Paul, in your first bullet
Mm.
point there under they should, that's super critical because if you're contracting a service provider to deliver 1851 compliance services, that contract needs to list precisely what's required, the number of hydrants, the number of fire doors, the number of extinguishers, because the problem that exists in New South Wales pre 18 February 13th was people inspected and done what they thought they wanted to do. And
Yeah.
what a building owner thought they wanted, and a service provider what they it was sort of just gentleman's agreement. And
Mm.
if you're now working under an 1851 contract, you want to make sure that every single hydrant and hose reel on that building is being is and the service provider's aware. If there's 13 hydrants on a building, make sure that that's in his contract and you get the service records. Because one day someone finds a fire hose reel or an extinguisher or a system that wasn't being tested, and the contract document, if that doesn't detail what the scope of works was, you're in a bit of a fight there with a contractor who said, "Well, you never asked me to do it." I would
So
define
it's time
precisely.
to review contracts, Simon, in that regard. And it sounds like best practice of the contract is, can we have a copy of our asset schedule on site as
100%.
well,
And
annexed to the contract?
on the FPA website, we actually do have downloadable for members and non-members an Excel spreadsheet that sets out the asset registers that might help someone hold their service provider, no, in effect, work with the service provider because the service provider as well, they want the asset list correct as well. They'll get
Yeah.
paid what's on site then. They'll avoid an argument down the track. So
Yeah.
really encourage tidying up the contract. Everything flows from that.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Simon. Now, we also have the provisions of renovations and fire safety compliance. And one of the things we're learning through this time is when owners are tending to do, if, cosmetic works, minor renovations and major renovations, we need to start looking out for these things. Are we moving a smoke alarm? Is the smoke alarm being moved? Is there an impact? The one thing that's been really interested is plumbing and what they call passive fire, provisions in their collars around plumbing, etc. Now, those considerations are being made, and it's especially important if your building is submitting an annual fire safety statement, possibly before applying or approving those renovations to contact the fire safety contractor to make sure the works you're doing will not impact the fire safety measures in your apartment. Because if you're submitting an annual fire safety statement, your renovations could possibly need some adjustments or tweaks to standards to ensure compliance, and you don't want to be left on the back foot in that regard. I mean, looking at that, I'm seeing that's becoming more and more in that regard, and it's taking a lengthy process when we look at owners' renovations these days. We're not necessarily saying, hey, but if we're going to gut the apartment or reconfigure walls or do a bathroom and
Yeah.
we take out the ducting and we've got to look at the plumbing. Do you find that as a common scenario there?
Oh, look, to be honest, this is probably one of the more significant challenges which you've outlined there. And it's sort of, and I probably almost, it could be a webinar on its own, to be honest,
Yeah.
Paul.
Oh, true. I mean, we've only got limited time
No,
today, but
100%. And look, I'd like to think following today's webinar, I really would encourage and through yourself, Paul, maybe some sort of practical examples where we can help the people on this webinar sort of to address these issues, to be honest. And I'm sure there is relationships with building surveyors and so forth who can help navigate some of the challenges, working with councils as well to really understand. We're
yeah.
doing a lot of work with the Building Commission to really define, to better explain this, to avoid the confusion and avoid and make sure that the people hold the appropriate license and everything that needs to be in place is in place.
So it's a very good point because I think we might do that, and we'll give some practical examples after this.
Yes.
One of the points I may mention is if you're an owner or committee member. I know I've got some strata managers in attendance. Part of that training is if you see any aspect of fire doors needing trimming because you're installing flooring, or you've got a sprinkler in your apartment and you're putting in a false ceiling. You need to move the smoke alarm because you might be reconfiguring your lot in an apartment. These sort of things, please consult with your strata manager, get in touch with the fire practitioner or the contractor doing that. And possibly you might need to engage a certifier as well to ensure they comply.
And what you said there, if you're adversely affecting a safety measure, that's the alarm bells.
Yeah,
If you're impacting it, start working with the people who can actually understand what a good version of the outcome needs to look like.
definitely, yes. Now, I've put this in as a suggestion before anyone renovates. Take a look, ask your strata manager, are we submitting an annual fire safety inspection? I think we've briefly touched on this, but look at the provisions of if you're blocking any fire access, you're altering walls or fire detectors. Interesting, always clarify, a detector and smoke alarm are not necessarily the same thing in this regard. One detects heat, one detects smoke. Um, are you moving the smoke alarm? We would always sort of suggest that you get in touch with us, penetrations that come in and get the right advice. If you're penetrating a wall, am I impacting the fire safety measures in the scheme? Do I need to do any fire safety works? Um, when we're doing this in renovations, it's a very common, we want to support all our owners. Check your building bylaws, get the advice, notify your strata manager, make sure everything you've got in is writing to protect yourselves as an owner in that respect. Um, so I might work on some practical guides in that regard to send part of following our webinar session as well in that regard. I know we've got some very keen questions, so I want to ensure we can get to them. Look, questions at the AGM that may commonly come up. And one of the things that came up was a suggestion is, look, we consider emotion, just don't know what's going on. It's environmental planning assessment act, etc., that comes into play. So, look, for any owners in attendance, while you're attending those sessions, I know you feel as though it's a routine measure, but if you want to ask some questions, you want to have some understanding. When is the AFSS due? Is it submitted? Who is our fire safety service provider? Are they accredited? Are they now compliant with the standards? Because I know contractors have had to comply with the new standards as well. It's not just, they're not grandfathered. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Simon. Um, and are fire safety records on site? So, are there any defects reported? Have we considered a budget that is adequate? For our
Yeah.
pre-building, if you look at your building, you look at the strata plan, as a guidance, probably 8,500 to 9,000 predates the 1988 provision. And do we have any fire safety orders from council? Now, the one thing is important, don't take this as an opportunity to go to council if you're not submitting an AFSS, an annual fire safety statement, to say, I think we need a fire safety order. Start the discussion first, seek some advice, because fire safety orders can be useful to guide you on what they can do, but they can also put time pressures on a scheme in getting these works done. So if you don't have it, start planning, start asking the questions, and even engage a fire safety consultant who can give you some guidance, preliminary advice if you start through it. But what we know from your advice, and I want to thank you on that, Simon, is if you're pre-88 building, if you haven't got an AFSS but you've got fire safety measures, continue to maintain them.
Yeah.
Get a proper contract in place, make sure they're looked after, and get ready. Be proactive.
Yeah. Yeah. And just on the
Now,
logbooks there, Paul, I'm just going to
yes,
say there's been a couple of questions there, and there
yes,
are cabinets available with a 003 lock, and that's a universal lock that fire agencies and building managers and so forth have, and service providers. And to the comment about where they're located, that 1851 doesn't stipulate how a building should be being occupied and managed. So that's once again the difference between 1851 and the design requirements. 1851 won't tell a building owner how they're to store the records. That's a building owner's decision to take responsibility for that. We're just facilitating the site records.
yeah,
But it
no,
would
thank
make sense in certain situations for them to be in a locked cabinet, so that because of that particular site needs that. Yeah,
no, thank you. And the thing is that it's maintaining these logbooks and provisions on site. It's good to know. And I think we'll also need some sort of signage. There's a question in here is, do you really think they would do an inspection? Look, it's not necessarily asked for. You just don't know. It could be just one telephone call that they get an inquiry, a false alarm that would result in an
Right.
inspection. In my experience, I've seen where false alarms have come through and buildings have had an annual fire safety statement, fire brigades attended, and have resulted in fire orders to upgrade to a higher standard. So you just don't know, and it's a difficult question to answer, but. I think you've just got to be prepared and organised. It's a real structural organisation for the scheme. Now, a key takeaway is looking at it. We know it's mandatory from the 13th of February. We understand our 1988 pre-obligations for those buildings. Look, we understand the penalties are significant and renovations. We've got to be extra diligent. For all our owners, for all our clients, we will really reach out to say if there's any questions, attend the AGM. If you can't attend the AGM, pop us an inquiry. We would be more than happy to provide clarifications and support. We know we're not here to create any anxiety. We're here to support you. I want to really appreciate your time on here this evening, Simon, because you really look at it and as a managing agent, you say, well, where does my expertise bind in terms of the obligations. And I'm really appreciative to be able to give this
Yeah.
information. We are taking it. We are dedicated to support our schemes and clients. So no question's a silly question in this regard in terms of clarifying your obligations. Feel free to reach out to myself if you need some clarification. We'll definitely do that and go from there. Now, I've put a bit of a resource and further information here. We're going to send these links out because I know we do always have some interested parties as owners that come in and say, I'd like to read it myself. So there's the EP and A, Environmental Planning and Assessment, the regulations that are there. Strata Schemes Management Act is readily available. So if you're going away, Googling these things, we'll send you the link straight after this. There's also a building commission, the good practice guide. So I've got that and will that be circulated through and some additional websites that can be utilized as well. Now, I think we're going to have some time for some questions here and go through answering some of these questions. So, where should we start from?
Yeah, look, I'm just scrolling through them now, Paul, and there was one here.
Yes.
Does the fire brigade, are they going to check logbooks? And well, in truth, they turn up to a false alarm. They will be looking to the building owner to see how he contributed to the false alarm, and they will review the logbooks and they will ensure the system's being maintained appropriately. And if those logbooks detail defects, if those logbooks are incomplete, that leaves the door open for the fire agencies to charge for fire brigade attendances.
Okay.
So the logbooks are
So, in short, they do.
100%, and the
Good.
consequences are very real because there's a false alarm. And in Victoria, for example, whenever there's a false alarm, we have to send out the last three test dates of the fire panel to demonstrate that that system's being maintained.
Yeah, we
So
don't have to do that in New South Wales.
not in New South Wales,
Not in New South Wales, but
but there is a financial penalty for not
yeah.
make for false alarms. So
Oh, I couldn't.
you
Yeah.
need to maintain, you need to present a case as to why you shouldn't be charged for a false alarm. And lack of maintenance will be one of those reasons that they will apply the charge for.
Now, there's an interesting question here, and I want to answer this. I think it's important. Now, what happens where individual owner refuses to install smoke detection? Previous attempts have failed. Does the fine still apply? It's not common property. Can we force access? Now, a very good question because we're saying if it's not common property, the owner's corporation isn't submitting an AFSS. So commonly you'll have the smoke alarm regs that apply here. Um, Look, I think when I read this, the onus is upon the owner of that apartment to do so. Now, if it's rented, I know rental agents are asking questions about, hey, do you have a certificate for the smoke alarm? And we're responding with an annual fire safety statement to say, look, it says smoke alarm, which consists of
Yes.
the whole building. What's your take on an individual owner's obligation in this regard versus the owner's corporation? Because there's a
Yeah,
bit of
and
risk here.
I know 100%. And once again, and similar to what I said earlier, these sort of questions raise their heads, and I would defer that to the by a building surveyor, to be honest, and the local council. I think it'd be remiss because, to be honest, I'm not saying there's conflicting advice, but you'd want to articulate the issue precisely to give that to the subject matter expert because you would need that information to cover your own situation. So I would seek the guidance of a professional in that instance.
No, thank you.
Too dangerous.
Doesn't it? Yeah, too dangerous. Oh, I agree. I mean, and when you look at the insurance world as well, and you're managing the risk, it's really confusing for me because if there's a fire in the building, it becomes an insurance claim, possibly, the nature of the cause, right? No, I'm not saying it's always a claim, but it's one of those things you want to have a record that there's smoke alarms. It's a real grey area. So we might clarify that one a bit more. I saw a point here of 003 lock. Now, I had an interesting one that one of the teams reached out. We had an emergency and we found out the switch room had an abloy key. Now, these came around for a while, but the interesting part is cabinets having a 003 key. Now, what we heard was is fire brigades were given a whole bundle of keys and they really want us to use what we call a 003 NMB key so they can readily
Wow.
access it, having to then knock down the door because the abloy key is a unique key. It's not standard, it's unique to every building. So I just want to make that clear because it was really interesting that, we came to that. So ideally, a 003 key. Um, is the best way because they've got that key and they can come in and access it and gives you a peace of mind as well. I think a lot of people having to be on site to give them
Yeah.
access, you
Yeah.
want that peace of mind. Um, now, one of the things that we've got is this is actually an interesting one here. What obligation is there on top floor unit owners to allow access when there are ceiling penetrations into the common roof space? Now, I think this is the passive fire category. Is that right, Simon, in that
Mm.
respect? I would really say their obligation is like no other. They've got an obligation to provide access to enable the
Yeah,
inspection to be
and
done.
there was an earlier question I saw in regards to fire doors and apartment buildings now, and the challenge is the tenant is not giving access, the resident. Now, I'm a service provider. My job is to maintain the building, and there's 1,000 fire doors, and there's no one occupying that building. Sorry, the apartment on the day I go there. And that is a very significant issue for the fire industry because contractually, someone's priced to inspect every single fire door in a building, and through no fault of their own, the tenants are not provided access because they're not available or no one's on site on that day, and that then becomes a challenge for the building owner because they've they need to demonstrate that those fire doors have been inspected. The service provider hasn't been able to gain access to the fire doors, and there has to be a process in which the building owners have worked with to gain access so those doors are open so that they can be inspected. And the penetrations are something very similar, Paul.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
that's why the asset register is incredibly important that that forms part of the contract because if you haven't designated the fire doors that a service provider should be inspecting, you've left yourself exposed in the event that that door's never inspected and that door is then deemed to be the failure point in a fire event.
Yeah. Now, and there's no doubt we've got Section 123 of the Strata Schemes Management Act, which imposes an obligation to provide access, and there's provisions of costs that can be recovered from time to time for that secondary inspection, especially when you've given sufficient notice for that inspection. I've got a question here, which is about, fire control rooms or panels, small schemes, 2 to 40 lots. In this circumstance, it's a small block of 4 townhouses. Now, my understanding to this is whatever the existing fire safety measures are in place, unless ordered by council, is the obligation to maintain. What's your opinion in terms of fire control rooms or panels for a townhouse complex in that regard there, Simon, from
Oh,
your
look,
experience?
if there's a system that's installed to the Australian standard, that needs to be maintained in accordance with the Australian standard. I,
Yeah.
I, our challenge from an FTA perspective is understanding the uniqueness site by site variations and so forth. So I'm taking that system that's installed is compliant to the install standard, and as a consequence, and it's proposed 88, that building needs to be maintained entirely to 1851.
Okay. So it also, so just clarification, looking at the time of construction of that building, if it's post 1988, the obligations, and look, in an opinion, it's probably best seeking some qualified advice in terms of the obligations for the fire control room and the panels. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, if it needs an AFSS, it needs to be maintained. So
Yeah.
I assume in that instance that someone would be endorsing that measure on an annual basis. So as a consequence, that needs to be maintained. There's nothing there that tells me that that wouldn't be maintained to 1851.
No, thank you. Now, small scheme, six apartments, with no common areas in the building affected by these new regulations. Well, I think that's coming to the point of if it's post 1988, and your building is constructed with the requirements to lodge an annual fire safety statement.
100%. And because not some of those buildings may not have any hydrants, hose reels, extinguishers, then there's nothing to maintain. So if
But we could just be annually certifying the individual smoke alarms in the townhouses that still need to be
no,
submitted to
okay, so
council.
there is the smoke alarms under Section 6 if they're smoke alarms, and that but there's an AFS needed for that once again. So
Yeah.
um, I guess if a fire measure is installed in a building, and this came up in a lot of conversations last year, someone opts to install a system into a building and it's not an AFSS, it becomes this sort of they're duty bound to maintain that, but not under the regulations because the regulations are quite clear. If it's on an AFSS, it needs to be maintained to 1851.
No, thank you, Simon. And tell me, what's the false alarm penalty fee? I thought it increased from $1,500. Is it, what was it,
I think
$2,200
it
at one
has. I think there
stage?
was communication from Fire Rescue New South Wales
Yeah,
earlier this year to that effect. Yeah.
yeah.
We've been living
So,
under that in Victoria for many years. It's a very expensive activity. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, look, to that point, 800 to $1,500. I think it's just about the $2,200 mark.
And
Now,
can I just,
I,
or just a word of advice? From in a previous life, we supported the building owners and our clients. So if they did get false alarms, once again, talking in Victoria, we would help make representation to the fire brigade to endeavour to
mm,
have those charges waived. So I would like to think that the people on this call today and the building owners and their strata managers would have strong enough relationships with the service providers who can then work together to see if they can mitigate the chances of those costs being incurred.
Now, I've got one here, which is a very common question that's coming up with sustainability programs. Now, this is probably left field here, and none of these questions have been written, but I love this topic, and it's becoming more and more. What's your advice for EV owners, electric vehicle owners, and electric vehicle charging in vehicles? Now, I'm not going to ask you to
Yeah.
say you have to respond to that, but an opinion would be great in that
Oh,
regard.
so we've got technical advisory committees, we've got special interest groups, and one of the challenges that the building the built environment now has is the charging stations and Tesla walls and so forth. They can be installed post occupation, and you bring in a fire risk that wasn't there the day before. And the challenges have with the fire industry is in relation to EV fires and lithium battery fires, and there's no recognised method of protecting against those. There's no such thing as a lithium fire extinguisher, and there are sort of pre-engineered systems that can be installed to mitigate the risks of EV fires. But I know the NCC, the National Construction Code, is grasping with that, and that's for new builds. The built environment is significant, and there's no easy solution. Um, there's different stories in different buildings how they're dealing with it. Clearly, it's happening, but there's no fire solution because there's no agreed design methodology as to how you can protect against that risk.
Yeah.
Um, Don't
Thank
do it
you.
would be the best answer. But with the introduction of vehicles, it's just going to happen more and more. And I know that fire agencies have significant issues, and all the fire agencies have developed their own paper in relation to how they're addressing EV fires, because they're the agencies who need to get into basement car parks to access cars. So that's the big risk there.
No, thank you, Simon. Look, Simon, we've just hit 7 o'clock on the dot. I've got a whole bundle of questions. Um, I want to personally say thank you very much for attending, Simon. I know you've taken time out of your evening there to attend this session. You've given us great insight. I want to thank all our owners for attending this wonderful webinar. There is a lot to take away. We still have a lot of questions there. We are going to get to them and be able to answer them and provide you with some practical examples and answers to your questions, even the ones that we've answered live, along with the recording. I want to thank you all for attending to the owners. Simon, thank you very
No,
much
my
for taking
pleasure.
your time away. While I go away and read these questions, we'll definitely come back and give you some more answers. And if there's any queries or questions that come out, feel free to reach out to us. I want to thank everyone for attending. And look, if there's anything else that comes up, I'm sure to be in touch and wish everyone a pleasant evening.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you all.